The Grand Hotel in Geneva buzzed with activity. Diplomats from around the world had gathered for one of the most important peace conferences of the year. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and expensive suites filled every corner of the luxurious ballroom. Among the crowd stood Robert Sterling, a billionaire businessman known for his bold statements and even bolder personality. He owned hotels, casinos, and media companies across 3 continents. Tonight he wore his confidence like an expensive watch, flashy and impossible to miss. At the same event, President Joseph Kone of the West African nation of Nyamala moved through the crowd with quiet dignity. Unlike Sterling, who commanded attention with his loud voice and gestures, Kone spoke softly and listened more than he talked. His gentle demeanor often fooled people into thinking he was weak, but those who knew his story understood differently. Kone had started as a village school teacher before becoming a freedom fighter, and eventually leading his country to independence. He still carried himself like an educator, patient, thoughtful, and always ready to learn something new. During the private dinner, Sterling found himself at the same table as President Kone. The conversation flowed from politics to economics, and eventually, to culture. Sterling, never one to stay quiet for long, began sharing his opinions about different regions of the world. "You know," Sterling said, cutting into his expensive steak, "I've traveled everywhere. Been to every continent, seen every culture. But let me tell you something. Real innovation, real culture that comes from places like America and Europe." The other guests at the table shifted uncomfortably. A French diplomat cleared his throat. A British ambassador studied her wine glass intensely. But President Kone simply nodded politely and continued eating. Sterling, encouraged by what he thought was agreement, continued his monologue. "I mean, look at music, for example. The greatest composers, the most beautiful symphonies, the most complex pieces, they all come from the Western world. Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, these are the masters. Music is indeed universal," President Kone replied quietly. "Every culture has contributed something beautiful to the world of sound and rhythm." Sterling laughed, the sound echoing across the now silent table. "Come on, Mr. President. You seem like a smart man, but let's be realistic here. What has Africa contributed to classical music? To real music?" The tension in the room became thick enough to cut with a knife. Several guests put down their forks. The gentle clinking of silverware stopped completely. President Kone set down his water glass carefully. "I learned to play piano when I was 7 years old," he said simply. "My grandmother taught me. She learned from missionaries, but she mixed those lessons with our traditional songs." Sterling's eyes lit up with what he thought was an opportunity to prove his point. "Oh, you play piano? That's nice. I'm sure you know a few simple songs." "I've been playing for over 40 years, Kone replied, his voice still calm and measured. This was the moment that would change everything. Sterling, never able to resist making a dramatic gesture, stood up from his chair. His voice boomed across the entire dining room, loud enough for tables nearby to hear clearly. "Tell you what, Mr. President," Sterling announced, his arms spread wide like a showman. "If you can actually play the piano, I mean really play it, not just plinking around with nursery rhymes, then I'll kneel right here in front of everyone." The dining room fell completely silent. Servers stopped serving. Conversations at other tables died instantly. Even the soft background music seemed to pause in shock. Sterling looked around at all the faces staring at him, clearly enjoying the attention. He had made similar bold statements before and never had to follow through. In his mind, this was just another way to prove his point about cultural superiority. President Kone folded his napkin carefully and placed it beside his plate. He looked up at Sterling with eyes that held no anger, no embarrassment, just a quiet certainty that made several people at the table hold their breath. "There is a beautiful Steinway grand piano in the main hall," Kone said softly. "Would that be suitable for your challenge?" Sterling's grin grew wider. He was convinced he had just trapped the president in an embarrassing situation. "Perfect. Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the entire room, "we're about to have some entertainment." As word began to spread through the hotel about the unusual challenge, Sterling felt more confident than ever. He had traveled the world, met countless leaders, and in his experience, politicians were all talk and no substance. He was certain that within minutes, he would have proven his point about cultural achievements. What Sterling didn't know was that President Kone had once been offered a scholarship to study at the Paris Conservatory. He had turned it down to fight for his country's freedom, but he had never stopped playing. Music had been his companion through the darkest days of war, his comfort during the loneliest nights of exile, and his joy during the celebration of independence. As the two men walked toward the main hall, followed by a growing crowd of curious diplomats and hotel staff, neither of them could imagine how completely this moment would change both of their lives forever. The hotel's main hall transformed into an impromptu theater within minutes. What started as a quiet evening dinner had suddenly become the most talked-about event of the entire peace conference. President Kohn walked through the gathering crowd with the same calm dignity he had shown at dinner. His security team followed closely behind, their faces showing concern about the unexpected situation. They whispered urgent questions in his ear, but he simply nodded and continued forward. Sterling, on the other hand, was in his element. He loved being the center of attention, and tonight he had managed to create a spectacle that would be remembered long after the conference ended. He worked the crowd like a professional entertainer, shaking hands and making jokes. "Hope you all brought your cameras," Sterling called out to the gathering diplomats. "This is going to be one for the history books." The French ambassador approached President Kohn quietly. "Joseph, you don't have to do this," she whispered. "This man is trying to humiliate you in front of the international community." Kohn smiled gently. "Sometimes, my friend, the best response to ignorance is education." Meanwhile, hotel staff had removed the velvet rope that usually protected the antique Steinway grand piano. The beautiful black instrument sat in the center of the hall like a sleeping giant, its polished surface reflecting the crystal chandeliers above. News crews began arriving, having heard about the unusual challenge through social media posts from conference attendees. Camera operators set up their equipment while reporters tried to understand exactly what was happening. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling announced, now standing beside the piano like a game show host, "tonight we have President Kohn of Guatemala, who claims he can actually play this beautiful instrument. Now I want to be fair here. I'm not expecting Carnegie Hall quality. If he can play Happy Birthday all the way through without stopping, I'll honor my word." The crowd murmured at Sterling's condescending tone. Several diplomats exchanged uncomfortable glances. They could sense that Sterling was digging himself into a hole, but nobody wanted to interfere in what had become a very public challenge. President Kohn approached the piano slowly. He ran his fingers gently along the smooth wood as if greeting an old friend. Then he lifted the bench and adjusted its height with the practiced movements of someone who had done this thousands of times before. "This is a beautiful instrument," Kohn said, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent hall. "A 1923 Steinway Model D. They don't make them like this anymore." Sterling's confident expression flickered for just a moment. That was a very specific thing to know about a piano, but he quickly pushed away any doubts. Lots of people knew facts about expensive things without actually being able to use them. "Yeah, it's worth more than most people's houses," Sterling replied. "Hope you'll be gentle with it." President Kohn sat down at the bench and placed his hands above the keys without touching them. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, as if he was preparing for something much more important than just proving a point to a rude businessman. The hall became so quiet that people could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning. Camera operators zoomed in on the president's hands. Reporters held their microphones ready to catch every note. "Before I begin," President Kohn said, opening his eyes and looking directly at Sterling, "I want you to know that I don't do this to embarrass you. I do this to honor my grandmother, who taught me that music is the language that speaks when words are not enough." Sterling waved his hand dismissively. "Very poetic, Mr. President, but talk is cheap." "Let's hear what you've got." What happened next would be replayed millions of times on social media, analyzed by music experts around the world, and remembered as one of the most powerful moments in diplomatic history. President Kohn placed his fingers on the keys and began to play. The first notes were soft and simple, a traditional lullaby from his homeland that his grandmother had hummed while teaching him to read. But within seconds, the simple melody began to evolve and grow. Sterling's smug expression started to change. This wasn't Happy Birthday or Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. This was something completely different. The president's hands moved across the keys with fluid grace, and the simple African lullaby transformed into something that bridged continents and cultures. He wove traditional rhythms together with classical techniques, creating a sound that was both ancient and modern, both familiar and completely surprising. People in the crowd stopped whispering. Camera operators forgot to adjust their angles. Even the hotel staff who had been clearing tables in the background stopped their work to listen. Sterling stood frozen beside the piano, his mouth slightly open. This was not what he had expected. This was not what anyone had expected. The music filled the grand hall and seemed to reach into every corner, every heart, every memory of everyone present. It spoke of villages under African stars, of children learning their first songs, of the universal human experience of finding joy in melody and rhythm. And President Cohn was just getting started. Word spread through the hotel faster than wildfire. Text messages flew between rooms. Phone calls interrupted late-night meetings. Social media posts started appearing with hashtags like Taishan Piano Challenge and Taishan Geneva Showdown. Within 20 minutes, the main hall had transformed from an elegant but quiet space into something resembling a concert venue. Diplomats who had been preparing for bed hurried down in their hotel robes. Journalists who had filed their stories for the night grabbed their cameras and rushed to the scene. The hotel manager, a nervous Swiss man named Klaus, worried about the growing crowd exceeding fire safety limits. But when he saw President Cohn sitting peacefully at the piano, preparing for what was clearly going to be an extraordinary performance, he decided to let events unfold naturally. Sterling moved through the crowd like a politician at election time. He shook hands, posed for selfies, and repeatedly told anyone who would listen about his bold challenge. His security team tried to keep up, but they looked increasingly concerned about the situation spiraling beyond their control. "This is going to be fantastic," Sterling announced to a group of reporters. "I mean, I feel a little bad for the guy. He seems nice enough. But someone needs to teach these world leaders that you can't just claim to be good at everything." Behind him, an elderly German diplomat named Heinrich Weber shook his head sadly. Weber had spent 40 years in international relations and had seen many embarrassing moments, but he sensed that tonight would be different. Tonight, someone was about to learn a very public lesson about making assumptions. The crowd now included people from every delegation at the conference. The Japanese ambassador stood next to the Brazilian trade minister. African Union representatives found themselves shoulder to shoulder with European Parliament members. Hotel staff had given up trying to serve drinks and instead found themselves caught up in the anticipation. Dr. Patricia Chen, a respected music professor from Berkeley, who happened to be in Geneva for a cultural exchange program, pushed through the crowd to get a better view of the piano. She had heard rumors about an African president who could play, but she remained skeptical. In her experience, most world leaders who claimed musical ability could barely manage simple pieces. "Has he started playing yet?" she asked a nearby diplomat. "Just finished warming up," came the reply. But even that sounded incredible. President Cohn sat quietly at the piano, seemingly unaware of the hundreds of people now watching him. He flexed his fingers gently and adjusted the bench one final time. His security detail had formed a respectful semicircle behind him, but they looked relaxed. Unlike Sterling's team, they had seen their president play before. The hotel's professional photographer, Ana Rodriguez, positioned herself to capture what she sensed would be a historic moment. She had photographed 3 different presidents, countless celebrities, and some of the world's most powerful business leaders. But something about tonight felt different. The energy in the room was electric with anticipation. Social media was already buzzing. A video of Sterling making his original challenge had been shared thousands of times in multiple languages. News outlets were picking up the story. CNN had already sent a crew from their Geneva bureau. BBC World Service was preparing for a possible live broadcast. But the most interesting part of the gathering crowd was how diverse it had become. This wasn't just diplomats and journalists anymore. Hotel staff had called their families. Local Geneva residents who lived nearby had heard about the event and somehow talked their way past security. Music students from the nearby conservatory had arrived with their professors. A group of African diplomats stood together near the front of the crowd. They knew President Cohn's story better than anyone else. They remembered when he had given up his scholarship to the Paris Conservatory to fight for his country's independence. They had heard him play at private gatherings, at state celebrations, and during the quiet moments when he thought nobody was listening. "Should we warn the American?" asked the ambassador from Ghana. He made his choice and replied the Nigerian representative. "Sometimes people need to learn lessons the hard way." Sterling, still confident despite the growing sophistication of the crowd, positioned himself prominently where the cameras could capture his face when President Cohn inevitably struggled with whatever simple song he attempted to play. "Remember, folks," Sterling called out to the crowd. "I said if he can really play, not just press some keys and hope for the best. This is a Steinway grand piano, not a toy keyboard." The crowd fell silent as President Cohn finally spoke. "I would like to dedicate this performance," he said in his gentle but clear voice, "to my grandmother, Fatima, who taught me that music has no borders, no color, and no politics. Music simply is." He paused and looked directly at Sterling. "And to Mr. Sterling, who has given me the opportunity to share something beautiful with all of you tonight." The grace and dignity in his words made several people in the crowd shift uncomfortably. Here was a man who had been publicly challenged and potentially embarrassed, yet he was choosing to respond with kindness and education rather than anger or revenge. Sterling felt a small flutter of nervousness for the first time all evening. Something about the president's calm confidence was beginning to worry him. But he pushed those feelings aside. He was Robert Sterling. He had built an empire through bold moves and calculated risks. He wasn't going to be intimidated by one soft-spoken African president and his piano. The hall fell completely silent as President Cohn placed his hands on the keys for the final time. Hundreds of people held their breath. Cameras focused. The world was about to witness something that would be talked about for years to come. And President Cohn began to play. The first notes floated through the hall like gentle rain on a quiet morning. President Cohn began with a traditional melody from his childhood, a simple song his grandmother had taught him about the river that ran through their village. The melody was haunting and beautiful, but Sterling relaxed slightly. This was exactly what he had expected, a nice little folk song that any amateur could manage. But then something magical began to happen. The simple melody started to grow and evolve. President Cohn's left hand joined his right, adding a bass line that gave the song depth and complexity. The folk tune from rural Africa began to dance with classical European harmonies, creating something that was both ancient and modern, both familiar and completely new. Dr. Chen, the music professor, gasped audibly. She recognized the technique immediately. This was advanced classical composition happening in real time. The president wasn't just playing a song. He was creating a musical story that built layer upon layer of complexity. Sterling's confident smile began to fade. This wasn't what he had expected at all. The melody shifted into what classical music lovers would recognize as a variation on Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. But President Cohn played it with subtle African rhythms that made the familiar piece sound completely fresh. His fingers danced across the keys with the precision of someone who had spent decades perfecting his craft. "My God," whispered Heinrich Weber, the German diplomat. "He's extraordinary." The crowd stood mesmerized as the music continued to evolve. President Cohn seamlessly moved from classical European pieces into jazz improvisation that would have impressed musicians in New York or New Orleans. But he never abandoned the African rhythms that formed the foundation of everything he played. Ana Rodriguez, the hotel photographer, found herself lowering her camera. She realized she was witnessing something too beautiful to experience through a lens. This was music that needed to be felt, not just documented. Sterling stood frozen beside the piano, his face showing a mixture of shock and growing panic. Every note that filled the hall made his earlier words sound more ignorant and embarrassing. The man he had dismissed as culturally inferior was demonstrating a level of musical sophistication that Sterling could never have imagined. The president's hands moved across the keys like they were having a conversation with the instrument. Sometimes gentle and delicate, sometimes powerful and commanding, but always with perfect control and emotional depth. He played sections that required technical skill that took most pianists years to develop, but he made it look effortless. A group of music students who had arrived from the Geneva Conservatory stood with their mouths open. Their professor, Dr. Laurent Dubois, had initially come to witness what he assumed would be an embarrassing amateur performance. Instead, he found himself listening to piano playing that rivaled the best concert pianists in Europe. "Who is this man?" whispered one of the students. "I don't know," replied the professor, "but he's incredible." The music told a story that everyone in the hall could feel, even if they couldn't understand it with words. It spoke of vast African landscapes under starlit skies. It sang of children learning their first songs around village fires. It carried the pain of colonization and the joy of independence. It bridged centuries and continents, connecting every human heart in the room to something larger than themselves. President Cohn's eyes remained closed as he played, but his face showed deep concentration and evident joy. This wasn't just a performance to prove a point. This was a man sharing his soul through music, offering a gift to everyone present. The African diplomats in the crowd exchanged knowing looks. They had heard their colleague play at private gatherings, but tonight, he was playing with a passion and intensity they had rarely witnessed. It was as if Sterling's challenge had unlocked something powerful within him. As the performance continued, people began pulling out their phones not to post on social media, but to record something they knew they would want to hear again and again. The hotel's professional sound system was automatically recording everything, but individuals wanted their own copies of this extraordinary moment. Sterling's security team noticed their boss's increasing distress and moved closer. One of them whispered in his ear, suggesting they could find a way to gracefully exit the situation. But Sterling was trapped by his own public challenge, and the dozens of cameras pointed in his direction. The music grew more complex and emotionally powerful with each passing minute. President Cohn incorporated elements of gospel music he had learned from missionaries. Traditional African percussion rhythms he translated to piano keys, and classical techniques that demonstrated formal training at the highest level. Dr. Chen found herself wiping away tears. In 30 years of teaching music, she had rarely heard anything so moving and technically impressive. This wasn't just good piano playing. This was artistry at its finest. The performance had been going for nearly 10 minutes, but it felt like both seconds and hours. Time seemed suspended in the magic of the music. People who had planned to stay for just a few minutes found themselves completely captivated, unable to leave even if they had wanted to. Sterling looked around the hall desperately, hoping to find some way to escape the growing realization that he had made a terrible mistake. Every face in the crowd showed the same expression of wonder and admiration. Nobody was looking at him anymore. All attention had shifted to the man at the piano who was demonstrating exactly why assumptions about culture and ability could be so dangerously wrong. And President Cohn was still building towards something even more spectacular. What happened next elevated the performance from impressive to absolutely breathtaking. President Cohn began weaving together musical traditions from around the world, creating a tapestry of sound that told the story of human connection across cultures and continents. He started with a melody that sounded distinctly Indian, his fingers creating the intricate patterns reminiscent of classical ragas. But within moments he had blended it with Irish folk melodies that spoke of green hills and ancient stories. The two traditions should have clashed, but in his hands they danced together like old friends meeting after years apart. The German diplomat Heinrich Weber recognized fragments of Bach's compositions flowing seamlessly into what sounded like traditional Chinese pentatonic scales. Impossible, he murmured to himself.
How does he know all of this?
Dr. Chen, the music professor, stood transfixed as she recognized advanced techniques from at least 6 different musical traditions. This wasn't just someone who had learned piano. This was someone who had studied the musical heritage of the entire world and somehow found a way to make it all speak the same language. The crowd had grown completely silent except for the occasional gasp of amazement. People who had arrived expecting to witness an embarrassing amateur performance found themselves experiencing something that many would later describe as life-changing. President Cohn's hands moved across the keyboard with increasing intensity, but never lost their precision. He played sections that would challenge concert pianists who had spent their entire lives perfecting single pieces. Yet he made each transition seem natural and inevitable. Sterling watched in growing horror as his assumptions crumbled around him. This wasn't just about piano playing anymore. This was a demonstration of intellectual depth, cultural knowledge, and artistic sensitivity that made his earlier comments seem not just wrong, but profoundly ignorant. The music began to tell specific stories. President Cohn played a section that clearly represented the sound of African drums, but he created the rhythm using only piano keys, making the instrument sound like an entire percussion ensemble. The technique was so advanced that several music students in the crowd started taking notes, trying to understand how he was creating such complex rhythmic patterns. Then the music shifted to something that sounded like the wind across vast savannas. The melody was simple but haunting, painting pictures in the minds of everyone listening. People could almost see herds of animals moving across endless grasslands, could feel the warmth of African sunshine, could hear the calls of birds they had never encountered. "This is extraordinary," whispered Dr. Laurent Dubois, the conservatory professor. "He's not just playing music, he's painting with sound." The performance moved into what classical music experts would recognize as variations on themes by Mozart and Beethoven, but President Cohn played them with African rhythms and harmonies that made the familiar composition sound completely fresh. He was demonstrating that great music could be enhanced and enriched by different cultural perspectives, not diminished by them. Ana Rodriguez, the photographer, found herself completely absorbed in the emotional journey of the music. She had attended hundreds of cultural events, but she had never experienced anything that communicated so powerfully without using a single word. The African diplomats in the crowd exchanged proud glances. They knew that President Cohn was sharing not just his personal talent, but the rich musical heritage of their entire continent. This performance was becoming a masterclass in the sophisticated artistic traditions that many people around the world knew nothing about. Sterling's panic was now clearly visible on his face. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. His security team positioned themselves closer, sensing that their boss might need support when this performance finally ended. The music grew more emotionally powerful with each passing minute. President Cohn played sections that spoke of struggle and hardship, but always resolved into themes of hope and resilience. He was telling the story of his people, his continent, and ultimately, the human experience of overcoming adversity through beauty and creativity. Dr. Chen wiped away tears as she recognized the profound emotional intelligence behind the performance. This wasn't just technical mastery. This was someone using music to communicate truths about human dignity, cultural richness, and the power of art to bridge seemingly impossible divides. The performance had been continuing for nearly 20 minutes, but nobody in the hall showed any signs of restlessness. If anything, people seemed to be leaning in closer, not wanting to miss a single note of this extraordinary musical journey. President Cohn began building toward what everyone sensed would be a powerful climax. His hands moved across the entire range of the keyboard, using techniques that incorporated everything he had demonstrated so far. African rhythms, European classical structures, Asian melodic patterns, American jazz improvisation, all flowing together in a magnificent celebration of human musical achievement. Sterling looked around desperately, realizing that every person in the hall was witnessing him being proven spectacularly wrong. His challenge had backfired in the most public way possible, but there was no escape now. He had made his promise in front of hundreds of people and multiple cameras. The music swelled to fill every corner of the hall, reaching into every heart, touching every soul present. President Cohn was demonstrating that culture, talent, and wisdom could not be measured by geography or skin color or political assumptions. And he was building toward a finale that would leave everyone speechless. The finale began with a single pure note that seemed to hang in the air forever. President Cohn held it just long enough for everyone in the hall to feel the weight of what was coming. Then, like a master storyteller reaching the climax of an epic tale, he launched into the most spectacular section of the entire performance. His hands flew across the keyboard in patterns so complex and beautiful that several people in the crowd gasped out loud. He was playing what sounded like an entire orchestra, but it was just one man and one piano creating layers of melody and harmony that seemed impossible to achieve with 10 fingers. Dr. Chen, the music professor, found herself shaking her head in disbelief. In 30 years of studying piano, she had never witnessed technique this advanced combined with such profound emotional expression. This was the kind of performance that happened maybe once in a generation. The music built to a crescendo that filled the entire hall with sound so powerful and beautiful that it seemed to make the crystal chandeliers vibrate in sympathy. President Cohn was giving everything he had, pouring decades of study, practice, and life experience into these final moments. Then, as suddenly as a summer storm ending, the music began to wind down. He returned to the simple African lullaby he had started with, but now it carried all the weight and beauty of the incredible journey he had taken everyone on. The melody that had seemed so basic 25 minutes earlier now sounded like the most profound musical statement anyone had ever heard. The final notes faded into absolute silence. For a moment that felt like an eternity. Nobody in the hall moved or spoke. The silence was so complete that people could hear their own heartbeats. Everyone seemed to be processing what they had just witnessed, trying to understand how one performance could be so technically brilliant and emotionally moving at the same time. Then the applause began. It started with Dr. Dubois, the conservatory professor, who began clapping slowly and deliberately. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted in the most enthusiastic ovation many of the diplomats had ever witnessed. People weren't just clapping, they were cheering, whistling, and some were openly crying. President Cohn rose from the piano bench with the same quiet dignity he had shown all evening. He bowed slightly to the crowd, then turned to look directly at Sterling. The businessman stood frozen in place, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. Every eye in the hall turned to him, and the weight of his promise hung in the air like a physical presence. The cameras that had been focused on the piano now swung to capture his reaction. Sterling's security team moved closer, whispering urgently in his ear. They were clearly advising him to find some way out of the situation, but Sterling knew there was no escape. He had made his challenge publicly, in front of hundreds of witnesses and multiple cameras. The performance had been so extraordinary that trying to claim it didn't meet his standards would make him look even more foolish. "Well," called out someone from the crowd, "a promise is a promise." The pressure was enormous. Social media was already exploding with videos of the performance. News outlets around the world were picking up the story. Sterling realized that within hours, millions of people would know about his challenge and would be waiting to see if he honored his word. Heinrich Weber, the German diplomat, felt a mixture of sympathy and justice as he watched Sterling struggle with his decision. He had seen many powerful people learn hard lessons about humility, but never quite so publicly or dramatically. Ana Rodriguez positioned her camera to capture what she knew would be a historic moment. Whatever happened next would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The African diplomats watched with satisfaction but without cruelty. They had witnessed their colleague demonstrate the dignity and talent that they knew he possessed, and now they were curious to see how Sterling would respond to being so thoroughly proven wrong. Dr. Chen found herself hoping that Sterling would do the right thing. The performance had been so beautiful and profound that it deserved a response worthy of its magnificence. President Cohn stood quietly beside the piano, showing no signs of triumph or gloating. His expression remained kind and patient, as if he was simply waiting to see what would happen next. His gracious demeanor made Sterling's position even more difficult. It would be hard to refuse a gesture of respect to someone who had shown such class and dignity. The silence stretched on as Sterling wrestled with his decision. His entire reputation was built on being bold, confident, and never backing down from a challenge. But he was also a businessman who understood when he had been completely outmaneuvered. Finally, slowly, Robert Sterling began to move. The crowd held its breath as he took a step toward President Cohn. His face showed a mixture of embarrassment, amazement, and something that might have been the beginning of respect. "Mr. President," Sterling said, his voice much quieter than usual. "That was—" He stopped, seemingly unable to find words adequate to describe what everyone had just witnessed. The hall remained completely silent as Sterling struggled with the most difficult moment of his public life. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a powerful man being forced to confront his own prejudices and assumptions in the most public way possible. What happened next would determine not just Sterling's immediate fate, but how this extraordinary evening would be remembered by history. The moment stretched like a tightrope between shame and redemption. Sterling stood facing President Cohn, his usual swagger completely gone, replaced by something none of his business associates had ever seen before: genuine humility mixed with undeniable awe. "Mr. President," Sterling began again, his voice barely above a whisper, "that was the most incredible thing I have ever heard in my life." The admission hung in the air, raw and honest. For the first time all evening, Sterling wasn't performing for an audience or trying to prove a point. He was simply a human being who had been profoundly moved by something beautiful and had to acknowledge it. He looked around the hall at the hundreds of faces watching him. Diplomats, journalists, hotel staff, music students, all waiting to see if he would honor his word. The weight of their expectation was enormous, but somehow less frightening than it had been minutes earlier. "I made a promise," Sterling continued, his voice growing stronger. "And a man keeps his promises, especially when he's been proven so completely wrong. With those words, Robert Sterling, billionaire businessman and owner of hotels across 3 continents, slowly lowered himself to one knee in front of the African president. The hall erupted in a mixture of gasps, applause, and camera flashes. Some people cheered, others remained respectfully silent, but everyone understood they were witnessing a moment that would be talked about for decades. Sterling knelt there for several seconds, his head bowed while President Cohn stood quietly above him. The contrast was striking, the powerful businessman humbled by his own ignorance, and the dignified leader who had responded to disrespect with grace and education, rather than anger. But what happened next surprised everyone, including Sterling himself. President Cohn extended his hand and gently helped Sterling back to his feet. The gesture was so full of kindness and dignity that several people in the crowd began crying again. "Music," President Cohn said softly, but his voice carried clearly through the silent hall. "Knows no borders, no prejudices, no politics. It speaks the language of the human soul, and that language is the same whether you're in New York or Nairobi, Paris or my grandmother's village." He paused, still holding Sterling's hand in a gesture that spoke of forgiveness and hope. "What I played tonight wasn't just African music or European music or American music," Cohn continued. "It was human music. Every culture has contributed something beautiful to the great symphony of human achievement. My grandmother taught me European classical techniques, but she also taught me that our traditional songs had just as much beauty and complexity." Sterling nodded, unable to speak. The man he had dismissed and tried to humiliate was now offering him a lesson in dignity and cultural understanding. "I don't ask you to kneel because I proved you wrong," President Cohn said with a gentle smile. "I ask you to stand because we can all learn something from each other." The crowd watched in amazement as the 2 men stood together beside the piano. Sterling's transformation was visible on his face. The arrogance and assumptions that had defined his earlier behavior were being replaced by something that looked like genuine curiosity and respect. Heinrich Weber, the experienced German diplomat, wiped away tears as he watched the exchange. In 40 years of international relations, he had rarely seen such a powerful demonstration of how grace and dignity could transform even the most hostile situations. Dr. Chen approached the 2 men, still shaking her head in amazement. "Mr. President," she said, "I teach at Berkeley, and I have to tell you that what you just played was absolutely extraordinary." "Where did you study?" President Cohn smiled. "My first teacher was my grandmother, then the village school. Later, I was offered a scholarship to study at the Paris Conservatory, but I chose to stay and fight for my country's independence instead." "You gave up Paris Conservatory to become a freedom fighter?" Dr. Chen asked in amazement. "Music will always be there," Cohn replied simply. "But freedom, that was something my people needed right then." Sterling listened to this exchange with growing amazement. Here was a man who had sacrificed what could have been an international musical career to serve his people, yet had somehow maintained and developed his incredible talent through decades of political struggle. "Mr. President," Sterling said, finding his voice again, "I owe you an apology. Not just for tonight, but for everything I said. I was wrong about so many things." The crowd remained silent, recognizing that this was more than just a public apology. This was a moment of genuine learning and growth. President Cohn nodded graciously. "We all make assumptions sometimes, Mr. Sterling. The important thing is what we do when we learn we were wrong." Ana Rodriguez captured photo after photo of the 2 men talking, knowing that these images would become iconic representations of how prejudice could be overcome through education and grace. Social media was exploding around the world. The hashtag Piano Challenge was trending in dozens of countries. Videos of the performance were being shared millions of times, with people from every continent commenting on both the incredible music and the powerful lesson about cultural assumptions. But in the quiet bubble around the piano, something even more important was happening. 2 men from completely different worlds were beginning to understand each other, and that understanding was opening doors that neither of them had imagined possible. Sterling looked at the piano, then back at President Cohn. Would you maybe teach me something about music from your country? I mean, if you have time before the conference ends?" The request was so humble and genuine that it surprised everyone, including Sterling himself. The businessman who had started the evening trying to prove his cultural superiority was now asking to learn from the man he had tried to diminish. President Cohn's smile was radiant. "I would be honored, Mr. Sterling. Music is always better when it's shared." The transformation was complete. What had begun as an evening of cultural confrontation had become something beautiful, a demonstration of how art, humility, and human decency could bridge any divide. 3 months later, the story was still making headlines around the world, but for reasons that continued to surprise everyone involved. The viral video of Sterling kneeling before President Cohn had been viewed over 50 million times across all platforms. News outlets had covered it from every angle, political, cultural, and musical. But what captured the world's attention even more was what happened after the cameras stopped rolling. True to his word, Sterling had spent the remaining 3 days of the Geneva conference learning from President Cohn. Every morning before the official sessions began, the two men could be found in the hotel's music room, with Cohn patiently teaching Sterling basic African rhythms and traditional melodies. Sterling proved to be a surprisingly dedicated student. His business success had always come from his ability to focus intensely on learning new things, and he applied that same energy to understanding music. More importantly, he began asking questions about African history, culture, and the incredible diversity of traditions across the continent. "I realized I knew nothing," Sterling later told journalists. "Absolutely nothing. Here I was, thinking I understood the world because I'd traveled to expensive hotels in different countries. But I had never really learned about the people, the cultures, the incredible achievements that exist everywhere." The transformation went far beyond just personal enlightenment. Sterling began using his considerable resources to support cultural education and exchange programs. His first major initiative was funding a series of concerts featuring traditional musicians from different African countries, performed in major concert halls across America and Europe. President Cohn, meanwhile, found himself in an unexpected position as a cultural ambassador. Music schools around the world invited him to give lectures and performances. The Paris Conservatory, which had offered him a scholarship 40 years earlier, awarded him an honorary doctorate and invited him to serve as a visiting professor. But perhaps the most touching development was the friendship that grew between the two men. Sterling visited Niamey twice in the months following Geneva, each time spending hours learning from local musicians and supporting educational programs. "Joseph taught me that real strength comes from lifting others up, not putting them down," Sterling reflected during a television interview. "I spent my whole life trying to prove I was better than other people. He showed me how much more powerful it is to celebrate what makes other people amazing." The impact extended far beyond their personal relationship. The Geneva incident, as it came to be known, sparked conversations about cultural assumptions and prejudices in boardrooms, universities, and government offices around the world. Dr. Chen from Berkeley started a new program called Musical Diplomacy, which brought together musicians from different cultures to collaborate and learn from each other. The program was so successful that it expanded to universities across the globe. Heinrich Weber wrote a book about his 4 decades in diplomacy, dedicating an entire chapter to that evening in Geneva. "In all my years of watching negotiations and treaties," he wrote, "I never saw anything change minds and hearts as quickly as one: man's willingness to share his gift with grace and dignity." The hotel in Geneva turned the main hall into a small museum commemorating the evening. The piano that President Cohn played became a centerpiece with a plaque that read, "Music knows no borders." They began hosting monthly concerts featuring musicians from underrepresented cultures. Ana Rodriguez's photographs from that night won several international awards, but she donated the prize money to music education programs in developing countries. "Those images captured something that changed how we think about each other," she said. "It seemed right to use them to help more people discover their own musical voices." More importantly, the incident inspired countless individuals to examine their own assumptions and prejudices. Social media filled with stories of people reaching out to learn about cultures they had previously dismissed or misunderstood. Sterling's business empire began reflecting his new perspective. He started partnering with local cultural organizations in every city where his hotels operated. His properties became showcases for local artists, musicians, and cultural traditions. "I used to think business was about building walls around your success," Sterling explained to his board of directors. Now I understand it's about building bridges to connect with the amazing people and cultures that make our world so rich. President Cohn continued leading his country, but he also found time to establish an international music academy in Niamala's capital city. Students from around the world came to study traditional African music alongside classical Western techniques. The academy's motto, inscribed over the entrance in multiple languages, came from something President Cohn said during his first lecture. Every culture is a note in the grand symphony of human achievement. Our job is not to play the loudest note, but to make sure all notes are heard. 1 year after Geneva, Sterling and President Cohn reunited for a special concert at Carnegie Hall. Sterling had progressed enough in his musical studies to perform a simple duet with his teacher, a traditional Nyamalan song that Cohn's grandmother had taught him as a child. The performance was modest compared to the spectacular display in Geneva, but the audience of world leaders, musicians, and cultural ambassadors gave them a standing ovation that lasted nearly 10 minutes. As they took their bows together, Sterling whispered to his friend, "Thank you for teaching me that the best way to win is to help everyone else win too." President Cohn smiled and whispered back, "My grandmother always said that music was just the beginning. The real lesson is learning to listen to each other." The story that began with prejudice and challenge had become something beautiful, a testament to the power of humility, grace in the universal language of human creativity, to transform hearts and change the world. And somewhere in a small village in Nyamala, an elderly woman who had taught her grandson to play piano decades earlier smiled as she listened to the radio broadcast of the Carnegie Hall concert, knowing that her simple lessons about music and dignity had somehow reached around the world to touch millions of lives.